Hello there, everyone. So happy to see you. I'm Joel Chasnoff. Welcome to Inside Israel. As you know, we always start about a minute or two after the hour. It's exactly 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 Central, where I happen to be. So we will reconvene in about 75 seconds. Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff. Today is December 2nd of 2024. It's the week of December 4th, and I really do want to say thank you all for joining me. Tonight's episode is called Deal or No Deal. And we'll get to the actual episode in a moment, but first, we do have a little bit of front matter that I want to put forth before we actually begin the broadcast. Number one, this week's episode, the one that you're hearing right now, is not going to drop on Wednesday. So if you can't stay for the whole thing tonight and wanted to see it or listen, or if you know someone else who can't make it tonight but wanted to, on Wednesday, it is not going to drop on Apple and Spotify. I'll explain why in a second. But you can see the video recording by tomorrow. It'll be up on my website. So it will not be on Apple and Spotify this Wednesday. The reason is I have a interview running this Wednesday. This week is one of the weeks that we're running an interview version of the podcast. I sat down with the one and only Yossi Klein Halevi. I don't know if you've heard of him. If you haven't, you should. In my opinion, he should be the Pope. He should be the spokesman, not just for Israel, but for the Jewish people. He has an amazing book called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. He's been on hundreds of podcasts since last October. So what's different about him being on mine? Well, I told him, if you're coming on mine, we are not going to talk about the same things you talk about on every other person's podcast. I want this to be the Yossi you didn't know. So what I really wanted to do was sit down and get to know him up close and personal. The title of the podcast is called Yossi Klein Halevi Unplugged. And we talk about the reasons he moved to Israel in the first place, his favorite Israeli song, his favorite slang word in Hebrew, and all the other stuff that really makes him tick. He is really a gift to the entire Jewish people, and I think the best spokesperson Israel has had over the past 2 years, perhaps even in the last 50. He's up there with Abba Eban and some of the others, Shimon Peres, etc. So if you want this up close and personal look at Yossi Klein Halevi, join me. Well, I won't be there live. It's a recorded session, but check it out this Wednesday morning. It'll be dropping on Apple and Spotify. And the links to those are on my website, joelchasnoff.com. That's where you can sign up for those. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, next week's live episode of Inside Israel, like we're doing right now, it's going to be, again, Monday night. That will be the 9th of December at 9 p.m. Eastern. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about Lebanon, including my own experiences there when I was a soldier in the IDF. You know, there's so much talk these days about ceasefire with Hezbollah and that we had this war against Hezbollah in 2006 and now we're back again in Litani River. And yet I realize that there's some real basics about Lebanon that most people don't know. Like, why did we go in there in the first place? When did we go in there in the first place? Were we successful when we first went in there? All these other mysteries about Lebanon, this country that is just north of Israel, and yet we sort of take it for granted that we're at war with Hezbollah. I guess the question I want to answer is, did it really have to be that way? And what does Lebanon actually mean to Israel and to the Israeli people, especially to those up north who live on the border? So next week, it's going to be Lebanon Unpacked. You really don't want to miss that one because really all the questions you have about Lebanon, always wanted to know, but we're afraid to ask. I will try to answer them. And on that note, send me your questions ahead of time. If you want to know something about Lebanon, including my own experiences there when I was a tank soldier serving in Lebanon, I'm happy to answer them. Okay. Third piece of front matter business is about December 24th. As you know, December 24th is Christmas Eve. And every year on Christmas Eve, I host a comedy show called Christmas Eve for the Jews. It's at City Winery in Manhattan, in New York City. So if you live in New York or the five boroughs, if you live in New Jersey, Connecticut, or you want to drive in from Baltimore, Delaware, Boston, or wherever else, if you're going to be in New York City on December 24th, come on out to Christmas Eve for the Jews at City Winery. I'm hosting the show. It's also going to be Talia Reese. She's our headliner. Really funny. She's been on NBC and other shows. Avi Lieberman, a good friend of mine who's a great comedian, as well as Marcus Lustig with Brian Gelfand on the piano. It's a great event. This is the 13th year we've done it. It sells out every year. It's about an hour and a half. The doors open at 5:30 till 7 is an hour and a half of dinner. They have kosher certified wine, as well as food, which is not certified kosher, but certainly kosher style. And you can order in kosher food ahead of time. If you need it, you can let me know. And tickets are on the City Winery website, which I'm going to put right here. And I have a special discount just for podcast listeners and newsletter subscribers. That discount is Joel20. So if you use Joel20 at checkout, you will get 20% off your tickets, which is an enormous amount. They never give this out to artists, but they gave it to me. And that discount code expires tomorrow night at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you want to join us in New York City on December 24th, Christmas Eve for the Jews, a night of comedy, so that we have something to do besides Chinese food and a movie. That's why I started this thing 13 years ago. Come on out on December 24th. I would love to see you there. And let me know if you're coming, because I would love to get a group of Inside Israel listeners together at some point during the evening, right before or right after, take a picture and just meet each other. So that is the front matter. Let us now get to tonight's episode. Okay. So tonight's episode is called Deal or No Deal. And before we actually begin that part of it, I'm going to start with a little story. Some of you might have seen this week that there was a college football game between the University of Michigan and Ohio State. It's what's called rivalry week in college football. I happened to be on the road in Toronto, Canada for a couple of shows in Ontario. They're not celebrating Thanksgiving this past weekend, so I did some work there. And I won't lie to you. When I'm in Israel, I don't watch television on Shabbat. I try to be as Shomer Shabbat as I can be, in a way that brings the spirit of Shabbat to the family. So we will drive to the beach or drive to an activity, and I'll even spend a little money if it's part of our family activity, but I won't watch television or even use my computer on Shabbat when I'm home in Israel. But when I'm on the road traveling, I guess I'm a perfect conservative Jew, right? I was raised in the conservative movement, and we're really good at sort of molding the laws around the needs of the time and where we are. And man, when I'm on the road, I watch way too much college football. It's one of the things I loved as a kid. And one of the big games this week, rivalry week, was Ohio State versus Michigan. And this made a little bit of a headline because at the end of the game, the players from Michigan who defeated Ohio State at home in Columbus, Ohio, took the University of Michigan flag and they planted it, attempted to plant it in the middle of the football field, right on the big O, which is the symbol of Ohio State. And a fight broke out. There was this fist fight that then broke out between the two teams as Ohio State attempted to defend their sacred O from the Michigan players who were trying to put a flag there. And it got pretty violent with players beating each other and throwing punches, and it had to be broken up a number of times. And all I could think about as I watched this fight unfold in the middle of the football field was how vastly different the experience is for 18 to 22-year-old American kids in college versus 18 to 22-year-old kids, I still call them kids, in Israel. And what a blessing it is that your biggest rivalry is Michigan or Ohio State and not Hamas or Hezbollah. And part of me thinks that I'm a little bit obsessed. And I'd love to hear from you. Do you think that I'm obsessed, that I walk around seeing the world as this comparison between what Israeli kids have to go through versus other people? And I want to make clear, I don't do this with in adult situations. I don't see adults at a dinner party in America and think, "Oh, Israeli adults can't go to dinner parties." We do, and we enjoy ourselves, and we go to the movies, and we do other fun things in Israel. But when it comes to 18 to 22-year-olds, my heart is in a different place. I just can't disattach myself from the vastly different childhood that Israeli teens have and really Israeli kids have from a very young age. You know, there was a quote in the Israeli media a couple months ago. I think it was Benny Gantz. I won't swear to that, but I do think it was Benny Gantz, who said, no matter what happens with Hamas, boys who are in middle school now will still be in Gaza fighting this war. And I have a kid in middle school right now. And the thought of him and his friends at the age of 14, 14 and a half, that 5 years from now, they could be the ones in Gaza. I mean, I shuddered when I read that quote in the newspaper. And I just, there's something about the teens that I always see it through that lens. And this is not to put down anyone out here in the audience tonight who has kids in college or, yeah, I mean, that is what you do when you live in the US, Canada. You send your kids to university after college. And I get a lot of emails from high school seniors saying, hey, I read your book. I'm thinking of joining the Israeli army. Do you think I should? When should I? And I always say the same thing. I recommend that they do go to college. I say, get your degree. You weren't raised Israeli. Israelis were raised knowing they're going to go to the army. You were not. You're probably not as mature as Israeli kids are. So go to college and then go into the army if you still want to when you're 22 years old. So I have nothing against the college experience. But when I see this kind of outlier event where 18, 19, 28, 1-year-olds are fighting each other with fists over whose flag goes on what place in the football stadium, it just makes me think that they are so blessed that this is their biggest worry, that this is the fight they need to have. And not have to worry about going into combat or not have to worry that they're home on Shabbat right now on Saturday, but tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., they're getting on a bus and riding up to Metula or down to Be'er Sheva to catch an army shuttle into Lebanon or to the Gaza Strip. So it just really shook me. And I see these reminders all the time. And part of me thinks that, man, I got to do something about this obsession because when it comes to the kids, the 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, I just see so much through the lens of what they're experiencing. And it's kind of a habit I can't break psychologically. But I wanted to share that with you. And it brings us to a perfect bridge to Omer Neutra, Zichrono Livracha. Today it was announced that Omer Neutra, who was kidnapped on October 7th, it turns out that he was killed on October 7th and his body taken into Gaza. Omer Neutra, you know, of the 101 hostages who are still in Gaza, he probably got a little more press time than others. His parents spoke at the Republican National Convention. They were very outspoken, not necessarily supporting Trump, but supporting a political party that would actually take action and do something to get not just hostages out of Gaza, but American hostages out of Gaza. And this has been totally dropped from the conversation here in the United States. There are American citizens being held in dungeons and cages in Gaza. And when I say dungeons and cages, that's not a metaphor for a cold, dark place. That's literal. The hostages who have been released in a deal that happened over a year ago now have said that at times they were kept in literal cages. And the IDF, in their raids in Gaza, have come across places where hostages were held in cages. Hirsch, Zichrono Livracha, and the five others who were with him were held underground without exposure to sunlight, to fresh air. They were in the cold. There are American citizens being held hostage in these hellholes, and the American people do not give a shit. And that just blows my mind. Or more than it blows my mind, it makes me think that they are in for a serious surprise. Because at some point, if they are in the wrong place at the wrong time, if they decide to take a, trip to Turkey or some other country, or even a European country where we know that Hamas is building up its arsenal. Two Hamas operatives were arrested, I think it was last week, in Germany for stockpiling weapons in Germany. It could be any one of them. It could be any one of them, any American citizen in the wrong place at the wrong time. So this is their problem too. It is not just those of us who happen to be living in Israel. So it made me think of Omer, not just because of that, but because he was an 18-year-old who was already accepted to university here in the United States. He's from Long Island, and he was accepted at Binghamton University in New York. And he chose to instead defer his enrollment and join the Israeli army as a lone soldier. And lone soldier, if you don't know, is an actual legal term. A lone soldier is any soldier serving in the IDF with neither parent living in Israel at the time. And that's what I was back when I was a lone soldier in the IDF. And that's what Omer was. And he, like me, was a tank soldier in the Armored Corps. I was in the 188th. He was in the 7th Armored Brigade. But unlike me, I stopped after attaining the rank of corporal. He went on to become an officer. He was one bar. I don't even know how to say it in English. Lieutenant, I think. Yeah, lieutenant is one bar. In Hebrew, it's seren. I want to reiterate to you how difficult it is to become an officer in the Armored Corps. One of the unique things about being in tanks is that 1 out of every 4 soldiers needs to become a commander. Every tank has 4 soldiers in it. There's a driver, there's a loader who loads the missiles, there's the gunner, that's what I was, and then there's a tank commander. So when you have an infantry platoon of, say, 30 soldiers, 1 out of every 30 infantry soldiers that you draft needs to be smart enough, capable enough to become an officer, a commander. In Armored Corps, 1 out of every 4 needs to become a commander. So the Armored Corps really is a place for high intellectual level soldiers. It's somewhat of a nerdier, and I don't mean nerdy in a bad way, but a little more of a bookish brigade. You tend to have, as opposed to the gevel manly men that you might find in infantry, you have guys who might be a little more soft spoken and quiet. I must say, I wanted to be an infantry soldier, but I ended up in the Armored Corps, and it was the perfect place for me because I already had a college degree, and I'm kind of bookish and nerdy myself, and it was really a great fit. So for Omer to go on and to become an officer, it says a lot about him. Not only to become an officer, but to do it in a country where that wasn't his first language. He grew up speaking English, and I think he had Hebrew in the home as well, but he wasn't surrounded swimming in Hebrew the way Israelis are. So kol hakavod to him for actually going on, not just to become a lone soldier, but to become an officer. And he did forego his college matriculation to become a soldier in the IDF. And yes, today it was announced that in fact he was killed, and on October 7th. I want to share with you what Israelis are actually saying about that. It's kind of harsh. But one of my MOs here on Inside Israel is, to tell you the truth, because I want you to know what Israelis do say. And it's actually something I agree with as well. And it pains me to say it. But that a few people I spoke to today, that when they heard the news that he not only was dead, but that he had been killed on October 7th, there were a few of us, and again, myself included, who said that that is actually the better outcome. that we would rather find out that he was killed on October 7th than find out that he was killed yesterday. That he did not sit as a hostage for well over 400 days only to be killed, but that it was quote unquote immediate and that he didn't have to suffer through that hell of being held hostage there. So, on the one hand, that is what the few Israelis I spoke to today, that was sort of the sentiment. And it's hard to hear, but at the same time, I have a feeling that a number of you could actually agree with what we're saying and might even agree yourselves. I do want to add that Omer apparently had roots in Ra'anana. And one phenomenon in Israel right now is that when you drive into a town, there's often a sign with pictures of hostages from that town who are being held in Gaza. And Omer's picture is on many of these signs in Ra'anana, and I never knew why. I didn't think he was a Ra'anana native. I knew he was American. But it turns out that he had Ra'anana roots, and a big vigil was held tonight in Ra'anana for him. My guess is that there is a big, what's called Merkaz Klita, an absorption center for new immigrants in Ra'anana. And specifically, they specialize in lone soldiers. So when lone soldiers first come to Israel and they have nowhere to go, there's an absorption center in Ra'anana that takes them in, and they live, in dorms, and there's a mess hall, and it's sort of like their transition home. And it could very well be that that is where he considered himself a Nana person simply because that's where the absorption center was, and maybe he even had family and friends there that he came home to on the weekend, or an apartment there himself. I would have to actually check that out. But there are vigils for him in Ra'anana. The other thing I want to mention is that Trump today made a declaration that the hostages better be released by January 20th, by the time he's sworn in, or else there will, quote, be all hell to pay. And as you know, as I've told you on this podcast, I'm not like a huge Trump fan for reasons that many people aren't. But I got to tell you, when I read Trump's statement that hostages need to be released by January 20th, or else there will be all hell to pay, and he was talking about Hamas and unleashing American military might upon them, my eyes a little bit welled up with tears, because it was the first time, and it's unbelievable, but it was the first time since October 7th that a major American politician has said what has absolutely needed to be said all along, that there are hostages being held in Gaza, and that if you don't release them, all hell will be unleashed upon you. Why did it take so long to say this? Why has every other politician felt the need to do this hand-wringing in this song and dance about how we mourn for the people of Gaza and Israel's policies need to be re-examined to look for a way forward? I mean, look, Israelis are not happy about the killing of women and children in Gaza who are innocent. But I've said you before on this podcast, we're not all hung up about it, because our enemies use human shields, and they brought this upon themselves. And any other country in the world would act not just as we are, but would go a step beyond. We're taking precautions that are way beyond what other countries do in terms of dealing with civilian populations. But it just seemed like such a breath of fresh air that finally a politician was not afraid to declare that America has military might. And one of the things that really turns me and a lot of people off about the Democrats right now is this wimpiness, this absolute lack of cojones, that the Houthis can bomb shipping routes and bomb Israel, and we sit here on our asses doing nothing. Wow. I'm going to get an E on my podcast this week. I usually don't swear this much, but I guess when the emotion is high. Someone wrote something in the comments right here, but is it easier on the parents for their child to find out that their child has been killed on October 7th? Look, a lot of Israelis, just about every Israeli I have had a conversation with in general since October 7th, has said that if it were, God forbid, their own child, they would rather they had been killed immediately than to sit in Gaza for even a month, let alone 400 plus days. I mean, who we all don't want to even think about that. But, there was that one hostage father who, when he found out his daughter Emily, this is the Irish girl, when he found out that she was quote unquote killed, he got the news that she'd been killed. He said he breathed a sigh of relief. He then later found out that she was alive and that she might come back. And then, of course, he was overjoyed. But I think the initial reaction was that given the choice between hostage or killed, and look, it's not hard to figure out. I mean, if you were given the option right now, your child hostage for 400 plus days in Gaza and maybe more, or killed, how would you answer? That's a terrible question. God forbid any of us would ever have to answer it. But this is why planting a Michigan football flag on the middle of an Ohio State football field seems totally inconsequential to me. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and I'll come back with the topic of tonight's episode. Welcome back. Again, Joel Chasnoff here with Inside Israel. And today's episode, as I said, is called Deal or No Deal. And what I'm talking about is the ceasefire that we have with Hezbollah. What I do not want to do here is to go into the details of what it says and what the agreement is, because I know you can do 10 minutes of research on Google and pretty much get that information. What I want to do is tell you what Israelis are actually saying about this ceasefire. And what prompted me to make this the topic is during this past weekend in Toronto, I was chatting with one of the guests. I gave a lecture on Friday night called Hebrew is Magic about, it's basically the newsletter, but in lecture form, and it has a PDF, and it's very cool. It's interactive. I teach about Hebrew words. But afterwards, there was a Q&A, and one person stood up and mentioned about how glad they were that we see these signs of peace with a ceasefire with Hezbollah. And when I heard that word peace, I almost shuddered because it made me realize, like, wow, there's really a delta. There's a gulf between how the rest of the world might see this ceasefire and what Israelis are actually thinking. So my goal here is to show you what Israelis are saying about this ceasefire. I do want to give you a few major points, though, about it, which you need to know. Number one is that it's a 60-day period before the IDF has to withdraw. So this is not immediate that the IDF is out of South Lebanon. The IDF is still in South Lebanon. And the goal there is to make sure that Hezbollah does not return to these villages in the south of Lebanon. I'll talk about this more next week in our in-depth talk about Lebanon itself. But basically, all the villages in South Lebanon were turned into Hezbollah little military bases. They were holding weapons, they were holding uniforms, other equipment that Hezbollah would need so they could show up in these villages and then attack Israel through the fence in an operation that would make October 7th pale in comparison. So the IDF is still there to make sure that Hezbollah does not enter these villages in the south of Lebanon for 60 days. So that's the first point you need to know. The IDF is still there. Number two, this ceasefire calls for Hezbollah to be north of the Litani River and not below it. What you need to know is that this is the exact same stipulation that was negotiated into the 2006 ceasefire that ended the Second Lebanon War. In 2006, the IDF was in South Lebanon fighting Hezbollah, and the ceasefire that ended that called for Hezbollah to be north of the Litani River, which is about, maybe someone look it up and put it in the chat. I believe it's 30 miles north of the border with Israel. This is Resolution 1701. The United Nations never bothered to enforce it. As I said, last year alone, the UN issued 8 times as many resolutions against Israel as it did against the entire world combined, but it never bothered to enforce UN Resolution 1701, calling for Hezbollah to be north of the Litani River. So what this meant is that even though there was a ceasefire, Hezbollah was roaming through South Lebanon undeterred. And I saw them myself. For a little while, I was part of a television show in Israel that was all about the Israeli army, the idea to bring the Israeli army to Americans. And one of our trips was up to Har Dov, which is it's not even in Israel. It's a piece of Israel that's been carved out and put a fence around it so that only the military can be there. And we were on Har Dov, and the soldier I was with gave me binoculars, and we saw Hezbollah walking around, with rifles, armed completely, even though they were not supposed to be there. So what you need to know is that what's been negotiated into this ceasefire, exactly the same as in 2006. The third thing you need to know is that it's already been broken, and this is happening only in the last 24 hours. But today, Hezbollah fired 2 mortars at Har Dov, this section of Israel in the deep, deep north of Israel, where the army is stationed. And, France and the United States are saying that Israel actually broke the ceasefire as well by sending drones over South Lebanese airspace to look for Hezbollah. Look, to me, this is another example of that U.S. government hand-wringing and game playing. I mean, look at the sides here. Hezbollah on one hand, who is a threat to democracy everywhere, and on the other hand, one of the most progressive, vibrant democracies in the world, and certainly the only one in the Middle East. How can you even compare them? And the fact that Israel is flying drones over South Lebanon, it's not for our own fun. It's because we are finding Hezbollah operatives walking around. Never mind that they're in uniform. Never mind that they have rifles. Never mind that they are walking toward rocket launchers. They are not supposed to be south of the Litani River. That's it. Hezbollah is not supposed to be south of the Litani River. Even to play a game of go fish on a table, they're not allowed to. The fact that they are, that's why we're sending drones there. And what France then came back and said is that Israel was okay to have these drones, but they didn't follow the protocol of notifying this committee of the U.S. and France. Well, I'm sorry. When you have militant jihadists operating in South Lebanon, we're not going to start making phone calls and writing emails to go up the chain of command. We need to defend our country against them. So that's the third point you need to know, is that the ceasefire has already been broken, and we then pounded back hard, and we need to. We need to take this opportunity when the ceasefire was broken to finish the job, because many Israelis believe that we haven't. And that brings me to the next part of this, which is, what are Israelis actually saying about this ceasefire? And Beth just wrote in, Litani River, 18 miles north of Israel. And I know the length between Israel and the Litani changes depending on where you are, and the further east you go, as Karen points out, it gets closer. But in general, let's say between 15 and 25 miles. So what are Israelis saying about the ceasefire? Number one, the group of people in Israel who are most against the ceasefire are people who live in the north of Israel. And you would say, isn't this counterintuitive? You would think that finally the North gets to go home. Wouldn't they be praying for a ceasefire? Actually, no. The opposite. They would rather keep on staying in hotels, in villages, in rental apartments that have been put aside for them. They would rather be staying there than go home to their houses and apartments on the northern border, where they are just kilometers, sometimes meters away from Lebanon, where they are certain that Hezbollah is going to continue to operate. So, number one takeaway, people in the north are very against this ceasefire. Number two, many, many Israelis believe that this is the right deal, but with the wrong enemy. What many Israelis on the street are saying is that this is the deal we should have made with Hamas, but not with Hezbollah. Now, why would that be? The logic is that Hezbollah right now, or let's say a week ago, Hezbollah was on its knees They were gasping for its last breath. And instead of stomping them out once and for good, we're agreeing to this ceasefire where they have a chance now to recuperate, rejuvenate, come up with a plan B. And that's what we're seeing right now. The IDF has estimated that we've destroyed 80% of their rockets. And that is really, really impressive. But when you have 40,000 rockets, 20% of that is what? 8,000 rockets that can hit anywhere in Israel? That's still a major threat. We're already seeing that Iran is trying to get new weapons into Lebanon to Hezbollah. So the idea that Hezbollah is going to walk away from the ceasefire deal and, I don't know, start crocheting blankets or something is absurd. Their goal right now is to figure out how can they rearm and be ready for the next attack on Israel. So many Israelis believe that with Hezbollah so close on its knees to its last breath, we needed to stomp them out and just finish the deal once and for all. Now, at the same time, what Israelis are saying is this is the deal we should have made with Gaza. How come? Because Hamas really has been dismantled at this point. They are no longer a military threat as a militia. They're operating in guerrilla units, teams of 3 to 10. They're very disorganized. They are not able to mount a major attack on Israel. So they would be the ones to actually make a deal with. And again, with the same stipulation that if you fire even one rocket at us, we are going to unleash our power on you. The other reason it would behoove us to make this deal with Hamas is Hamas has said that the only way we will get hostages out is if we withdraw our forces from Gaza. And I think we need to take them at their word at this point. I don't think that increased military pressure is going to be the thing that brings our hostages home. It is only going to be if we withdraw from Gaza. And the logic is if withdrawing from Lebanon will still keep Israel safe, then why would withdrawing from Gaza not allow Israel to feel safe? It really is a logic that I think speaks for itself. And the IDF has said that at this point, the military operation against Hamas has been completed. Because we have the hostages that we need to get home, that is why many in Israel are saying that this is the deal we should have made with Hamas, but not with Hezbollah. So that's takeaway number 2. Takeaway number 3. Most Israelis believe that this ceasefire actually doesn't really mean all that much for 2 reasons. Number 1, we expect it to be broken. We expect that it won't last, and already we've seen that. And number 2, just about everyone knows that the real threat here is Iran, in that until Iran's nuclear capability is destroyed, a ceasefire with Hezbollah doesn't mean all that much. That what we really need to do is take out Iran's nuclear capability. And I don't mean take out that we necessarily attack it, because I don't know what the right strategy is, but this is the real threat to Israel. And until that's done, Hezbollah is only a small part of that problem. So those are the 3 takeaways I really want you to leave this podcast with. Number 1, people in the north of Israel are the ones most opposed to it. Number 2, a lot of Israelis feel this is the right deal with the wrong enemy. And number 3, that the real threat here is Iran, and that the ceasefire doesn't mean much until that issue has been solved. I'm going to take a super quick break, then come back with the final segment, which is your questions. Welcome back. Question number one, we have two questions tonight. The first one is from Pam, and Pam wrote in to say, now that there is a ceasefire with Hezbollah, are Israeli school kids going to go back to their normal, meaning home schools in the north? And the answer is no. Not only are kids in the north not going to go to their home schools in the north, but residents of the north have been told not to return. And this shows you the government's own level of confidence in the ceasefire actually holding. The government is telling the people of the North, do not go home to the North, not yet, because they want to see if this ceasefire actually holds. And I think part of them actually knows in the government that it won't. So, no, to answer your question, Pam, the kids in Israel are not back in school, and residents of the North have not even gone home yet. Number two. Oh, okay. I had to read my own handwriting here. Number two, can you explain what's happened? This makes me laugh. Joel, can you explain what's happening in Syria right now and what is the threat to Israel? And that question, that comes from Renee, by the way. That question makes me laugh simply because, on the one hand, I'm not nearly smart enough to be able to explain to you what's happening in Syria. That said, I am possibly smart enough to give you a few short takeaways which can help you make sense of what's going on in Syria right now. The first thing is that these rebels who have already overtaken Aleppo and who are against the Assad regime, these are not peace-seeking, freedom-loving, free press believing in rebels who just want their kids to be able to go to school and then tennis practice. You know, these are jihadists. These are jihadi factions, one of which is an offshoot of Al Qaeda. In their dream, their scenario is that Syria will become an Al Qaeda like state, an Islamic state. So do not get the wrong idea that these rebels are freedom fighting rebels who just want peace and democracy and women's rights and gay rights, etc., for all. It is not that. Okay, these are jihadists who want an Islamic state in Syria. Number two, this can be seen as a glass half jihadist or a glass half empty of jihadists. What does that mean? This could be both good and bad for Israel. It's obviously bad for Israel for the reasons I just explained. We do not want or need an Islamic Al Qaeda state right next to us. We have enough problems. We have enough enemies as it is. Thank you very much. We do not need an Islamic state in Syria. At the same time, this is a blow to Iran because Iran is supported by, Assad in Syria is supported by Iran. He's also supported by Putin in Russia. So this is a blow to Iran and to Russia. And the only reason this is happening, that leads me to point number three. Why is this happening now? It's because right now it is an opportunity. Hezbollah is weak. They are not strong enough to help the Assad regime in Syria. Russia is weak. Despite what Putin says, all of his threats, their military is spread out, spread thin with this war that's been going on for, God, I don't even know how long. Years? A few years now, right? With Ukraine. And Iran is weak. All the more reason why this would be the time to squash Hezbollah for good and to make a run at trying to take out Iran's nuclear program. But in a way, this bodes well for Israel that Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah are seen as so weak. But of course, ultimately, we do not want an Islamic state, Al Qaeda style, next to us. I guess the question I need to ask is, there are many, many civilians being killed right now in Syria. Come on, Columbia University. Where are you? You should be taken to the streets right now, right? Innocent civilians are being killed right now in Syria. I would think this would be a reason to stop class and go take over the library, right? That concludes this week's episode of Inside Israel. I'm really thrilled and honored once again that you have joined me. Again, next week's episode is about Lebanon, Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, in exactly a week from now. Share it with your friends. Anyone who's curious about Lebanon, that would be the one to catch. This recording will be up tomorrow on my website. Christmas Eve, the 24th of December. I would love to see you there. I just put the link once again in the chat. It's a long link, but don't worry, it will work. And use the discount code I just put there, Joel20, until 5 p.m. tomorrow night. And let me know if you're going to the show. Drop me an email so we can say hi and raise a glass of kosher wine together. Thank you so much for coming out this week. I'm wishing all of us an uneventful week, a quiet week, and a week of shalom, peace. Until then, lahitraot, everyone. I'll leave the chat open for a few minutes. Laila tov.